Hi, everybody. Welcome to lecture 6.4 of Mystery and Reason. So, we'll continue our study of investigations that we started focusing on last time. We'll introduce a couple new concepts pertaining to that, and then I'll go through an extended example that has the colorful title of Max's Reckless Driving. We'll see what that's all about. So, let me summarize what we've talked about so far regarding investigations and how they relate to arguments, which is sort of our umbrella topic for this entire unit on critical thinking. I want to say investigations are dynamic arguments. They're arguments that change. Okay. So we've been studying arguments for a long time, and we recently started studying investigations. So we should probably articulate exactly how these two concepts are connected. That would be good, right? So an investigation is a dynamic argument. It's a process. So all the sort of light green words are supposed to go together here. It's a process by which an argument, both its explicit and implicit structure, and I'll remind you what that is in a second, but a dynamic argument is a process by which an argument changes and develops as the author or investigator learns more about the case. Okay? So there's it's a process, it involves change, it involves learning new things. And then as all that happens, as that investigation process takes place, the explicit structure, meaning the premises and the conclusion of the argument, and the implicit structure, which is the implicit question and the rivals, all of that can change as we learn more information. As we get more premises, that might change our conclusion. It might change our implicit question, although that's less common, and it certainly can affect our rivals, and we've already seen examples of that. So here's a little diagram that shows the development process in an investigation. So these are just random, examples of argument schemas and rankings of rivals. They don't mean anything. They're just letters that could stand for premises and conclusions. So let's pretend like we've got some argument where it's just one premise and one conclusion. And let's say we've come up with two other rivals, C2 and C3, and the author's conclusion, C1, is at the top of our ranking. So we again call that a sound argument for now, right? So at that stage of the investigation, there's only one thing we know. There's sort of a conclusion that seems like the best answer to that, and then we've come up with two other possibilities. Okay. And then let's say we get a new premise, S2. If that's added into the mix, perhaps it could do lots of things. Perhaps what it does is it raises C2 above C1. So S2 is strong enough support for C2 that it actually bumps it to the top of the ranking. And let's say the author is not just sort of separate from this whole process and they made their argument and they're sticking with it. Let's say they are the investigators. That's why I said author slash investigator up here. So they're changing their conclusion as they learn more information. Okay. Um, and so their conclusion changes to C2, and whoever's evaluating them thinks C2 is now the best conclusion. And so they have a new argument, which is still a sound argument, right? Because the evaluator, which is who's providing the ranking, agrees with their conclusion being the best. And then let's throw in one more stage, stage three. Let's say we get one more new premise, S3, and let's say what that does is it supports C2 even more than just the previous two premises, or really S2, which was the one that really brought C2 to the top. S3 piles on the evidence in favor of C2. It creates a gap indicated by these three dots between C2 and the other rivals. So now we might say this is a strong argument. Maybe these premises really do cover all the relevant information, and we have reason to think, as evaluators, that the investigators have done their job sufficiently. The conclusion that they have is not only at the top of the ranking, it's considerably more plausible than the others, and we think it's going to remain that way. And that's when we say, case closed, strong argument. For all intents and purposes, we we have figured out that the answer to the implicit question is C2. That's the how an investigation is completed. Okay. So this is all very abstract because we're not doing an actual example, but we will get into one in just a second. Let's just add one more concept into our toolbox here. So sometimes things aren't so successful when we're doing investigations, whether it's investigating a crime or doing a scientific research program. Sometimes we get stuck. Sometimes we don't get a good answer and we don't know what to do next. Okay? Here's what Larry says. Sometimes we work very hard, look at everything available, and still do not find a single rival compelling. What do we do in such a situation? Well, we can try to continue the search for specific support. Remember, specific versus general support. So we can search for more evidence about the case that we're investigating, even though it may be very unlikely for us to find it. So Larry goes on to say on page 187, we may understand perfectly the sorts of issues and phenomena with which we're dealing, but simply lack adequate information about the case itself to reach a secure conclusion. The problem is availability. We know what we lack, but our search has given us reason to think we will never find it. Something not recorded or irretrievable would make a difference. Okay. So let's say, I don't know, um, somebody has dropped uh, their phone off of a boat and it's pretty deep water. And, you know, where is my phone is sort of the implicit question. They know it's somewhere in the water, but the question is, are they really going to go to the trouble of getting, I don't know, scuba equipment and going in to dive it out? There's some things that they want, but they think maybe it's fried anyway because it's been, in the water for so long, it's not even worth going. So it's like, that's sort of what we're talking about here. There's information that would answer the question. Like we know where to find the phone. We know where to look for it, right? Um, but do we have the resources? Do we have the time, energy, and motivation to actually pursue the search to that extent? Okay, so that's sort of the situation that Larry's describing here. So in cases like these, one might say that we're simply unlucky. The specific evidence we need happens to be unavailable, but we do know what kind of evidence we need, so we can continue to search for it. Okay, maybe my phone dropped in the water example doesn't completely parallel this, but hopefully it's somewhat helpful. But we'll see other examples of actual investigations, and these would be called tractable investigations. As long as we know where to search for more evidence, we say it's a tractable investigation. Tractable just means it is sort of doable or feasible. We can make progress. We know sort of how to make progress. It might turn out that we're in one of these unlucky situations where the ways of trying to make progress are coming up short, but we can still try them. We know what to try, right? So that's what tractable means. It means we know what kinds of things we should be looking for, where we should be looking, how we should be looking. Whether or not we find anything, that's a further matter, but tractable means that it's possible. We think that there's a good chance we will find something if we pursue a certain lead. On the other hand, sometimes an investigation is intractable. This would be a situation where we don't even know what kind of evidence to look for. So here's how Larry describes these. What we call intractable investigations are those in which we are simply baffled by the case. What we need can be provided only by general support. Perhaps that's not the only situation that would make it intractable, but a lot of times that's what's going on. We don't even have the sort of knowledge base to know what we should be doing here, right? So we might need to do some not just search for specific support, but research and learning and finding experts in, making people experts in new fields, perhaps. So this could be a scientific investigation where we just get stuck and science doesn't progress because we just don't know what concepts, what techniques, what experiments we actually need in order to figure something out. But it doesn't have to be in science. So, as Larry says, common problems with everyday appliances, the ones we finally attribute to gremlins, perhaps illustrate this best. In other words, you've got some problem with your car or your fridge or whatever it may be, your computer, and you've taken it to people, a mechanic or a repair person or a tech, support person, and they figure some things out, but the problem keeps coming back, and you just think, you know what, this object is just cursed. It doesn't like me. It just has this weird, finicky problem that I have no idea what to do about. Maybe it's, not such a big deal. Maybe it means I have to get rid of the thing because I just can't fix it, right? So that would be an intractable situation. Let me see if I could make my phone example into an intractable one. So if let's say I don't know, yeah, I go somewhere and I leave my phone. I go all around a city in a day, and I don't look at my phone the whole time. Or it doesn't have to be my phone. It could be my, I don't know, car keys. Let's say I walk around LA for 6 hours, and then I get back to my car and I'm like, where are my keys? They could be anywhere, right? So any number of people could have picked them up. It doesn't look like I'm going to be seeing those again, right? As opposed to when I drop my phone in like a part of the water where I sort of know where to look. Here, it's too much to even begin trying to look for it, and it could have been taken by a person, unlike the dropping it into the water case. So that would be an intractable situation. Okay. Larry continues with his example, like my car mysteriously quits at random intervals on perfectly fine days, and a series of mechanics has not found anything wrong. We do not have a short list of serious rivals to guide us, and we may not even know what sort of rival to formulate. So the problem is intractable. Our general understanding is what needs supplementing just to make sense of the case. This means we do not know what we lack, and we have no way to estimate what an ideal investigation would turn up. So it could be intractable for the investigators. It could also be intractable for the evaluators. The investigators don't know what they think the answer to the implicit question is, and the evaluators aren't able to come up with any other rivals, or they've got maybe some other rivals, but they don't know how to rank them with the authors because nobody knows enough about the case. Okay. So in an intractable investigation, what we typically need is general support that's not just specific information about this case, but background knowledge, scientific knowledge, technical knowledge of an entire category of thing that our case belongs to. But it's the general knowledge that we're lacking, and that's why we just don't even know what to search for. So this is what I was hinting at earlier. We don't just need to search, we need to do research or find the right kinds of experts or make a new kind of expert. So if even the experts are stumped, then we need to wait for progress in the relevant sciences, which may take years, decades, centuries, who knows, right? Um, so that is what we would call an intractable investigation. Okay, so let's test these concepts out with an example. So suppose we haven't learned anything more about that poor flight 554 that disappeared in a storm, and we're left speculating. We never hear anything from them, and we don't find the wreckage. So is this tractable or intractable? What do you think? Do we know what sort of stuff we could look for? Well, Wright says this would be a standard case of a tractable failure. We know all sorts of specific support that would resolve the puzzle if we only had it. So we are stuck. So being stuck doesn't mean it's intractable. Intractable means we're stuck and we don't even know what to do. Being stuck in a tractable investigation means we could keep looking, right? We haven't searched absolutely everywhere for the plane's wreckage. We can keep looking for it if we have the resources, if we have the time. So there's things we can do, right? We can, keep asking, for witnesses, like, did anybody see a plane going down around here? We can go underneath the entire flight path of the plane and really search, right? So we know what sorts of things to look for. It's a tractable situation. Okay, so here's some examples. If we could find cockpit videotape, I mean, that seems pretty unlikely if we can't even find the plane. Um, but radar traces, we could like maybe go back into the logs of, radar, sweeps if that exists. I don't know. We could look for satellite information. We could look for ask other aircraft if they saw anything. We could find it. We could do an inventory of objects of the bottom of nearby bodies of water. These are the sorts of things we can look for, right? We're not stumped by what could possibly have happened. We just can't find it. We're pretty sure it went down in the storm. We just don't know where, right? So that's why it's tractable. Okay, but let me finish with a longer example, which I call Max's reckless driving. So this is about myself, and this is an experience I had several years ago while driving on the freeway, in which I carried out a very fast investigation. I should put that in quotes, scare quotes, in my head after I accidentally did a little bit of reckless driving. So I fully admit that I made a mistake here. As you'll see, it's not such a huge mistake, but anyway. So, and there's me with my son in Knott's Berry Farm. That's not the reckless driving. Here's how the story goes, and I'm going to give it to you in snippets. So, at first, I am on the freeway, and right before an exit, I realize I'm in the exit lane, but I don't want to take that exit. I want to stay on the freeway, so I have to swerve to stay on the freeway. And I was sort of in the far right lane, and there was two lanes exiting, so I had to get across one lane to get back to the one that's staying on the freeway. So, and of course, right after I do that, I look in my rearview mirror. Maybe I didn't check carefully enough before I did it, so that's why I was reckless, right? But I look in my rearview mirror to make sure, um, I didn't totally cut somebody off. And I see, here's the weird part, I see another car make the very same maneuver that I did. So I immediately start thinking. This is when a question is triggered, when something curious happens, when something unexpected happens, we get questions coming up in our mind. I got the question. Well, what's my question? Can you already figure out the implicit question before I give you my conclusion? Well, here's my conclusion. I immediately assume it's a police car about to pull me over for reckless driving. Okay. So, what question am I answering? So see if you can write down the implicit question or think it. It's something like, why did the other car do that? Why did they swerve in the same way that I did? So here's a little diagram, two exit lanes, and I had to cut across like this. I think it was late at night and there weren't that many cars on the road. That's what I'm going to tell you now. So it didn't feel like a super dangerous maneuver, but I knew that it was probably not great. I probably should have just stayed on the exit ramp and rerouted. But anyway, the fact that the other car behind me did it was what caught my attention. I want to know why they did that. And I'm assuming I'm about to get pulled over for reckless driving. So, stage one of the investigation, there's going to be four stages here. The schema. Okay, so what are the premises? So, this is the schema for the argument or inference that I'm carrying out in my head, in my thoughts. So, I think I noticed the car behind me swerved like I did. I then have so I'm put some implicit premises in here, by the way. So if I draw the conclusion that it's a police car, why would I think that? Why would a police car do the same thing that I did? Well, I'm thinking I might be guilty of reckless driving. I guess that's not entirely implicit. It's part of the way I phrase the conclusion, right? So I assume that it is a police car about to pull me over, and then the for reckless driving is what I'm turning into this. I'm expanding this into a premise. I might be guilty of reckless driving. So that's partly implicit in the way that I've worded it. Okay. And so my conclusion is a cop is pulling me over. All right, what about rivals? Rivals, what can you think of? So give yourself a chance to try this one before I show you. So maybe they're following me, but they're not a cop. Somebody who wanted to stay behind me, and so therefore did the same thing I did so that they could continue following me. That's one thought that might come to mind. I can't remember if I had that thought of that possible rival or not, but remember, the rivals are part of the implicit structure. The author of the argument, which is me at the time, might not be thinking about the implicit question or the rivals. What they're thinking are the premises and the conclusion, except for implicit premises. Um, anyway, okay. The other possibility is they simply made the same mistake as me. They also didn't want to take the exit, and maybe they would have taken it if they hadn't seen me swerve, and then they realized, wait a minute, do I want to be in this lane? That guy apparently doesn't, right? And so maybe that's what happened. They just also needed to stay on the freeway. And I don't think there's too many other possibilities here, right? Again, if you can think of anytime I go through an example like this, if you can think of uh, rivals that I didn't include that you think would be good to include, let me know. Okay. So, how about for the ranking? So, how do you think my reasoning is going so far? Is this a good conclusion? What would you say? Or do you think one of these rivals is more plausible? I think my conclusion is not bad. Why? Because, yeah, they could have made the same mistake as me, but that seems very coincidental, and the chances don't seem super high that two people would make that particular mistake at the exact same place on the road. Unless there's like reason, unless there's bad signage, and so maybe lots of people, this happens to lots of people, but unless we know something like that, that seems pretty unlikely, but it seems way more likely than C2. Somebody following me, right? Like maybe I cut them off earlier and they've got a horrible case of road rage and they want to chase me down and ram my car. That seems very unlikely. Um, or, if I had any enemies that picked this day to, stalk me to wherever I was going and beat me up or something, again, we would have to have reason to think of that those things are plausible based on support that's in the argument, but there isn't anything about that. If the person who's driving, let me pretend like it's not me, mentioned, that they had just cut somebody off, a mile earlier, then that would certainly support C2. But without something like that, C2 seems very implausible, almost not even a serious rival. Um, so I'd say C1 and C3 are pretty close, but I think overall, yeah, I mean, cops pull people over pretty often, but people don't make this kind of mistake that often. That's what I'm thinking when I put C1 over C3. Okay, good. What's next? So, let's articulate the relevance of the premises to the ranking of the rivals. So, what does S1 do? It supports all rivals equally. It's just the fact that the car behind me swerved. Remember, that's the kind of premise that triggers the implicit question. Without the car swerving, there wouldn't be a case here to talk about, right? So, the premise that does that, that triggers the implicit question, typically doesn't favor one conclusion over the others. It's where we get the rivals from in the first place. We sort of all get them because we're trying to answer the question that this fact triggers, right? Okay. S2, on the other hand, the fact that I did something that might count as reckless driving, and I'm assuming that that's illegal. So if reckless driving weren't illegal, or if what I did didn't count as reckless, then that might lower C1. Um, but, if we think that I'm right about S2, if S2 is true, it does suggest C1 is plausible, so it does help C1. I did something that a cop would perhaps want to pull me over for or need to pull me over for. So that's part of the reason C1's at the top of the ranking is because of S2, the fact that I was doing something reckless. Okay, so at this point, and how about the investigation? Are we tractable, intractable? What do you think? This is a good question to test to see if you understood those new concepts. Is this the kind of investigation where we know how to find more information? What do you think? Well, yeah, right? Of course we know. It's so tractable. It's highly tractable because I will presumably find out what's going on very soon. So this is in a way the easiest kind of investigation of all. All I need to do, all the person in the car needs to do is wait, and new information will naturally come about by just continuing to look at that car behind me and see what they do. If they are a cop and their lights start flashing, well, that answers the question. It was a cop pulling me over. If they start, tailgating me aggressively and then try to pull up next to me or try to ram me, well, then maybe it was somebody following me, right? Um, if nothing particular like that happens, then it's probably C3. So we're gonna find out which of these things is true pretty soon. Okay, so that makes it highly tractable. We're not even stuck. I was talking about cases where you're stuck, but it's tractable. We're the opposite of stuck. We just need to wait to see what happens, right? Okay, good. So, yeah, same ranking. That wasn't supposed to show up at the end. Okay, let's get to stage two. So what happens next? I look in the rearview mirror and I don't see any lights on top of the car. Okay. So that's obviously significant. I was just thinking it's a cop, and now I'm looking at it, I'm like, that's not a cop car. Or if it is, it's not one that has lights. Maybe it's like the police chief's car or something. Or maybe I think at the time what I did think, so I'm trying to narrate this the way that I was actually thinking at the time. I thought maybe it's an off-duty cop or an undercover cop or something like that. Somebody who's not in a normal police cruiser with lights on top, but is still potentially able to pull me over and give me a ticket or something, right? So that's what I'm thinking. Is it an off-duty cop? Okay, so my schema now includes a new premise, which is there's no lights on top of the car. And let's throw in another implicit premise. So just to make it clear what's already going without saying, why do I think it might be an off-duty cop instead of an on-duty cop? Well, because if they were an on-duty cop, they would be driving a car with lights on the top, right? So police cars usually have lights on top. This is such an obvious premise that we might not even need to include it, but it is something I'm relying on. It's some background knowledge that I'm relying on. It's a general support. It's a general premise, unlike well, actually, here, let's try that again. Let's try that. Which of the premises right now, the pieces of support here, are specific and which are general? Well, the car behind me swerved like I did, definitely specific to this case. I might be guilty of reckless driving. Well, what I did was specific to this case, but the fact that it might count as reckless driving is a general, category of event that this might fall into, right? This might count as a case of reckless driving. No matter who did what I just did, it would still, no matter when it happened, it would still count as reckless driving. So that's general. There's no lights on top of the car. That's specific. Police cars usually have lights. The word usually is indicator that this is definitely a general premise. Okay, so now my conclusion that an off-duty cop is pulling me over, why do I call it C1A? What am I doing here? I gave you an example of this before. I'm splitting C1, which was the cop is pulling me over conclusion, that was my previous conclusion. I've got to split that up because if I think it's an off-duty cop, that overlaps with the it's a cop rival. So I take the it's a cop wedge of the cloud diagram, if you will, and I slice it so that I've got the off-duty cop and the on-duty cop as separate sub wedges, if you will. And that means the other subwedge, that it's a cop who's not off duty, that's got to become another rival, right? So C1A and C1B together make up the original C1, but now I want to distinguish those because if they were on duty, they would probably have lights on the car and they don't. So that's why I specifically think it's an off-duty cop. Okay. And then we'll keep the other two rivals, but now the evaluation. What do you think? Do you think this is the most plausible answer compared to these other three? Well, it's certainly more plausible than C1B, right? I had a reason to split up the original conclusion and change my. So we're splitting it up as argument analysts and evaluators. At the time, I was just shifting my what I was thinking to it's a cop in general to ooh, specifically off-duty cop. And that implied, subconsciously, or not really subconsciously, but I wasn't saying to myself, therefore it's an off-duty cop, not an on-duty cop. But that's what I was thinking at the time in some, not fully articulate way. But we're articulating everything at this point. So that's why we split these up. Okay, so C1A does seem more plausible than C1B, but the fact that there's no lights on top of the car, you might say that's not just evidence against um, C1B, it's also evidence against C1A, right? Somebody might say, look, it's probably not a cop at all. And you, and I'm talking to myself in the past now, you're being a little bit paranoid or unreasonable, or you're not reasoning as well as you should. You're reasoning in an unsound way if you think it's an off-duty cop, because what are the chances, right? Have you ever been pulled over by an off-duty cop? Are they even allowed to do that? Would they do that for a minor infraction of the type that I just did? I think it's a minor infraction. So the ranking now, I think if we're going to think about this carefully, not in the heat of the moment like I was, we would say, you know what? It's looking like C3 is probably what's going on. They probably did just make the same mistake. C1A, that it's an off-duty cop, that seems pretty unlikely. So we're going to put that under a gap and say it's looking like C3 at this point. C2 still seems implausible, perhaps still even more so. Like somebody following me, I don't have any enemies, I didn't cut anybody off. That's like I said, a barely serious rival, but I'll still put it there at the bottom, but I'll put a gap here as well as a gap here. So it's almost surely C3 at this point. C1A, yeah, maybe. C2, hardly plausible, right? But anyway, what we've got now is an unsound argument, according to us right now, the evaluators, because we think Max, who the driver, was not thinking clearly, was giving too much weight to his original idea that it was a cop, perhaps, and couldn't shake that when he saw that there was no lights. But he should have, right? He should have given up on the whole cop idea at all once he saw there was no lights. Okay. Now I'm referring to myself in the third person. So it's an unsound argument. We don't think that my conclusion at the time is the most plausible answer. Oh, and by the way, C1B, I've taken it off the ranking entirely because if it's a cop that's not off duty, I don't know any police car that wouldn't have the lights on top, right? I guess I did mention the police chief might not have that. That still might be, Anyway, so maybe C1B is like down here near C2. Maybe we could still include it, but maybe we could take it off. Maybe we could take C2 off. It seems like it's between these two, but C3 is looking better. Maybe not significantly better. Maybe you don't like the gap there. But again, there's different ways of doing the ranking. These are judgment calls. If you strongly feel like I'm not doing the ranking in the best possible way, feel free to let me know. Okay, but let's keep going. Let's finish this up. So what should we do next? Let's talk about the relevance of the premises. So by the way, this example, as you can see, is bringing together all of the concepts that we've learned so far. So this is a nice sort of toy example. It's not super serious. It's not like a heavy duty investigation or anything like that, but it really is a good chance to practice all of these concepts and skills. So let's articulate the relevance of S3 and S4. I didn't really pause to let you try it, so try it. What do you have to do? You have to say which rivals S3 helps and which ones it might hurt, if any. Same with S4. All right, so S3, ready? The fact that there's no lights, that it definitely helps C1A. In fact, it's what creates C1A and C1B in the first place. The fact that there was no lights is why I split up my cop rival into off-duty cop and regular cop, right? So we would say the relevance of S3 is that it leads us to split C1 into C1A and C1B. It moves C1A below C3 since off-duty and undercover cops don't usually pull people over for minor violations. So it puts C1A down here instead of at the top. Oh yeah, and it takes C1B off the list of serious rivals, and it does that together with S4. S4, the fact that police cars usually have lights on the top, unless they're so police cars, in other words, cars driven by on-duty police officers, those usually or always have lights on top, almost always, let's say. So uh, that makes C1B highly implausible and takes it off the list or the ranking. Okay. So and the investigation, I should have let you try this. It's still tractable, of course. I just need to see what the car does next. So what happens next at stage 3? Next thing I notice is that the car has out-of-state plates. Okay, I guess this wasn't at night because somehow I was able to tell. Well, it's not that hard to tell that it's not a California plate if that's what you're used to seeing. I don't know if it was Oregon or Nevada or what, but I noticed that it has out-of-state plates. So now I start worrying that it might actually be someone following me for a nefarious reason. So I give up on the cop rivals now. I don't think a police officer would have out-of-state plates, right? So that's sort of my implicit premise here that I should have asked you to try to figure out. Why do I switch my conclusion to somebody following me that's not a cop? Because I don't think a police officer, even if they're off duty, would be driving a car that's not from the state that they work in. I don't know. Is that true or not? Well, that's going to be one of my implicit premises. So we have all the premises from before. Now we get the new information that the car has out-of-state plates, and my implicit thought is a cop, not an cop, even an off-duty cop, so any cop, probably wouldn't have out-of-state plates. That's my thought. Of course they could. It just seems pretty unlikely. Okay. And so together with everything I decide at that point that they're following me, but they're not a cop. So the rivals are still the same, and the relevance. So what happened? Well, the fact that it has out-of-state plates lowered the cop rivals well, they lower it for the author. Do we think as evaluators that that makes it less likely that it's a cop? I think so. So I thought so at the time, and I still think so. So S5 and S6 together lower C1A below C2, right? Actually, I say now it takes C1A off the list. I don't know if that's a little bit harsh, right? It could still be a cop. It's not a totally preposterous idea. Maybe they're driving a friend's car who lives out of state. But either way, it definitely hurts C1A. It lowers it in the ranking. However, as an evaluator now, I think me at the time that I was still being irrational or thinking unsoundly, it's probably not somebody following me. I say for some nefarious reason because I don't even know why they would be doing it. That should have been, that should have tipped me off to realizing that that's a paranoid thought. They're probably not following me. I just need to let them pass, right? So what happens in the end? Well, it's probably what you would have expected. When I take the next exit, because I guess that is where I was going, the other car continues on the freeway, at which point I am much relieved, although I'm still puzzled by the situation. I'm puzzled because I still don't really, it still seems weird to me that they did the exact same maneuver that I did, but it looks like that's all that it was. It was just a coincidence. So it is pretty unlikely what happens. Sometimes unlikely things happen, right? But I basically ruled out the cop or the stalker, and so what I'm left with is I guess they just made the same mistake as me, right? So I've got all the same premises, but my new premise is that I take the next exit and the car continues on the freeway. My conclusion is now they made the same mistake as me. That's implicit, by the way. It's hinted at the fact that I say at which point I am much relieved. Why am I relieved? Because I'm not going to get pulled over by a cop anymore, which I was thinking, and I'm not being followed by somebody for a nefarious reason. So that's what I'm much relieved means. It means, oh, they must have just made the same mistake as me. The relevance of this new premise is that it lowers C2, which was somebody's following me. It either lowers it or removes it from the ranking. And now the evaluation of this, of my reasoning, assuming that I actually did reach conclusion C3, so it's implied, but I think I did at the time. The argument is now sound again. It was unsound for a little bit when I was being paranoid, but now I have no more reason to be paranoid. I'm coming back to my senses. Okay. Um, and so it seems like at this point we can say that it is actually a strong argument because it seems very unlikely for there to be any further information that would modify the ranking of the rivals, right? I'm probably not going to see that car again. So we could say the investigation is complete if you're a little bit paranoid, and you think, hey, Max, maybe somebody was following you, and you think C2 does still belong in the ranking. Um, Here's why you might think that. Let's say it was somebody following me to try to beat me up or kill me or something, right? They realized what they just did. They realized that they made it obvious that they were following me and they were trying to do it secretly. And so they think, oh, this is too hot of a situation. I need to, pretend like I'm not following him, keep going when he exits. Otherwise, he's going to be on to me. This is what the stalker might be thinking, right? So it's still possible. It's pretty far-fetched at this point. It was to begin with. So still, I think it is a strong argument and that means I think that I was right in the end, that they did just make the same mistake as me. That's what I think now, evaluating this in retrospect, and I assume that you do as well. But again, I'd be interested to see what you think if you disagree. Okay. So here's how the final ranking might look. C2 might have, a place at the bottom. Like I said, maybe they were following me and they're gonna try to track me down later, because they gave themselves away. And so I put a double gap. That's sort of a way to indicate the strength of this argument is that C3 is at the top and it's likely to remain there unless there's serious evidence later on that brings C2 back up. Okay, but it's definitely not a cop because I don't know, or maybe okay, I guess it could have been a cop and they were gonna pull me over and they decided not to. Maybe they were driving their friend's car without estate plates and they were thinking, "Oh man, if only I were in my off-duty car, I could still pull this guy over, but since I'm driving my friend's car, I can't do that." Okay, so you could bring the cop rivals back in if you tell the right sort of story. But there we go. That's an example of a investigation. Again, kind of silly to call it that, but it's a dynamic argument or a dynamic inference where I'm thinking new information is coming in, I change my conclusion, more information comes in, I change my conclusion again. Okay, so that's how investigations work, even at this very sort of micro scale of just a few, thoughts in one person's mind over, I don't know, less than a minute of, driving. So that's a very, compressed version of what takes actual investigations a much longer time with much more people working on them. But I like this example because it brings in all of our concepts and lets us practice them without having any complicated, technical stuff going on. It's a situation that we all could be in. Okay, but don't do what I did. Probably just take the exit if you find yourself in that situation. All right, I'll leave it at that, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.